All right, I think we're live. So, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Boy Talk today. Before I introduce our guest today, I'm very excited to be talking to Anasuya Sengupta today. But before I introduce her, I just wanted to say a couple of words about Boy Talk. So, this has been sort of developed and organized by some friends here in Edinburgh during the lockdown. And it was a fantastic way of harnessing the new connections that we're making because we were all sort of locked down at home and couldn't go out and socialize and so on. And I thought it was such a wonderful idea to take this, what I find a quintessential Bengali idea of the adda, basically. We love a good adda, as you know, and put it online. And to me, this is probably me romanticizing it a little bit, but to me, it also has a sense of an essence of the sort of the French salon, where you sort of sit down and you discuss everything and anything under the sun, and you come up with interesting ideas that you debate, whether you're a capitalist or a communist or anything under the sun, really. So. A big thank you to them for providing us this platform today. I've been following Anasuya's work for many years now, and it's such a wonderful opportunity to talk to her today. And the only connection, of course, with Edinburgh Boy Talk is that our guests normally have some kind of connection to Bangla, be it West Bengal or Bangladesh. And so we'll talk about those connections as well in a little bit. But first, I'm going to say a few words about Anasuya. So Anasuya is a poet, she's an author, she's an activist, she's a scholar and a recipient of many awards. She has a background in economics and development. She has studied in Lady Shriram College of Delhi University. She has been to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, as well as a visiting scholar at Berkeley, and is now, along with Adil Vrana, the co-director and co-founder of Whose Knowledge. And during her journey, she's also worked at the Wikimedia Foundation, as well as being regional program director at Global Fund for Women. And we'll unpack these a little bit more when we talk about your journey, Anasuya. But I just first wanted to say a very big welcome to you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you. I'm sort of now missing my Shinghara and cha, but we'll try and make do.
Yeah. Indeed. And it's worth saying, perhaps, for our audience that both of us are extremely Prabashi. So just to keep...
I'm also Adhik.
You're also Adhik, yes. We'll talk about that a little bit. I'm Purapuri Prabashi because I was born and brought up entirely outside of India. But this is why we're mostly talking in English today, because that's what we're most comfortable in. But of course, we'll definitely talk about our bond connections as we go. And just to remind the audience, you're very welcome to ask some questions in the comments, and we'll either pick them up as we go or address them at the end if we can, as we can. So, Anasuya, I wanted to start today a little bit by sort of presenting to our audience the motivation and sort of the background behind why you do what you do. And so my first question is, why does it matter to find out? Why does it matter for us to know what kind of knowledge is on the internet, what kind of information is on the internet, and who produces that information, that knowledge?
Thanks, Ago. I didn't actually ask you what I should call you, but I'm just
perfect.
I'm just going straight to Ago, but it's a really important question to ask, because I think we take for granted that the internet is a democratic, emancipatory, liberatory space. And clearly, it's an essential infrastructure, and nothing has demonstrated that more than these past few months. And at the same time, as we recognize this global infrastructure that we're all sort of dealing with in multiple ways, it's important to ask ourselves, what do we find when we use this infrastructure, this global communication technology? And because we call it global, we assume that all aspects of it are global, whatever global means, and we can unpack that a little bit. But just for you to know who's online, when we look at the data, it basically says that over 60% of the world is online. So over 60% of the world is connected in some way. And we know that this is, it can be differentiated around different modes of access. I mean, most of those who are online through their phones, through smartphones. We know that, for instance, if you were sitting in India or in Bangladesh, the internet connectivity is based on the electricity connectivity, is based on a whole bunch of issues of class and caste and, gender. And yet, to know that over 60% of the world is connected through this global technology is important. And then you ask yourselves, of this 60%, who are these folks who are online? So 75% of those who are online are from the global south. So are from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Almost 45% or more of women are online. Yet the internet, when you look at it, when you look at, say, online public knowledge, it doesn't look like you and me. It doesn't look black, brown, in the languages that we speak. It doesn't look like, those of us who are essentially not white, male, straight, and from Europe or North America. And so to recognize that this notion of globality has to be deconstructed to recognize the power and privilege at the center of it, right? That those who design the architecture of this global infrastructure are essentially are in the minority, but they're in a powerful minority. And then when you look at public knowledge itself that's online, and I use Wikipedia as a proxy because all of us use Wikipedia, even if we don't always admit it, including your students, I'm sure. I don't know how many of the essays start with according to Wikipedia. And I'm a Wikipedian, right? I edit Wikipedia, and yet I give it a lot of tough love, and we can talk about it more. But when you look at Wikipedia, knowing that so many of us use it, asking ourselves who produces that information is really important. And we find that about 20% of the world, again, primarily from Europe and North America, produces over 80% of the content. Only 1 in 10 or 9 editors of Wikipedia might self-identify as being female or being non-binary. So when you look at that range and you look at what's on Wikipedia, then it's very likely that those who are writing about, I don't know, Kolkata on the English Wikipedia are less likely to live in Kolkata than they are likely to live in London. And of course, there might be Probashi Bangalis writing about Kolkata living in London, which is often true. In fact, the diaspora edits Wikipedia a great deal. But it is important to recognize that those who consume what is online, those who are using the internet, are not those producing its knowledge. And therefore, what is on the internet is still deeply underrepresentative of the worlds that we live in.
Thank you. That provides a very, very rich, I think, introduction to the many threads that we can actually follow in our discussion today. And it's interesting that you mentioned sort of the Probashi, the diaspora as well, because that's such an important part of the identities, and those different identities are not necessarily all represented. I mean, the diaspora often tends to be a privileged sort of community, not always, but again, within that diaspora, there are very many different voices that are or aren't represented on the internet. So on the issue of identity, I wanted to backtrack a little bit and ask about your background a little bit, about your childhood, about the many identities you have picked up on the way.
I know.
Today. So my understanding is that you grew up in Karnataka. Is that right?
That is. So my father is Bengali, which explains the Sengupta. Originally from Bangladesh. So my Thamma was from Dhaka. My Dadu was from Borishal. I've never been to Bangladesh yet, and I've always wanted to go. But that's a journey that remains. And they moved to Assam, to Ahom, in the early 1900s, from what I understand. My father was born in Gwalpara, which is, then he said a tiny town, no longer tiny, from what I understand. We have visited Gwalpara and the old family home. And then my grandfather, who was a lawyer, moved to Kolkata to set up practice because they were otherwise, not very well off. They were very lower middle class padrolog, as it were. And so he left the family so that he could, manage and only had the family join him much later. And then my father my father's the youngest of the family. And then he got a scholarship to go to school, and then he got a scholarship to go to university. And he ended up at Delhi University studying English literature, where he met my mother. So this is the romance of that sort of brought me into being. And because my maternal grandfather, who was a journalist, said to my father, being a teacher is not going to help you, cope with the family. So at that point, my father, being a good lefty, there were two ways, as I remember him saying it, there were two ways that you could go. You could either become, revolutionary Nakshal, right? Yeah. Many of his friends at that time, they were born in 1948, so they were really Midnight's children. They were the first generation in post-colonial India. And so you would either go underground and, fight the state, or you became part of the post-colonial state to try and rebuild the state in a much more libertarian fashion. And so he joined the Indian Civil Services, the IAS, and ended up in Karnataka because he didn't, choose West Bengal as his home cadre, because you can, but he decided not to. And I think part of it was because it was, my grandparents were very welcoming to my mother, but not everyone in the family was. It was a cross-caste, cross-region, cross-language marriage relationship. That wasn't easy. And so I think, they were sort of setting off on their own. And he ended up in Karnataka. So I spent much of my early childhood in North Karnataka, which is the Deccan Plateau. So is semi-arid, one of the poorest parts of southern India. But it is beautiful in its resilience and richness. So all of these many threads came together. Yeah.
What really strikes me here is that our identities are so filled with stories of migration as well, right? Because we wouldn't be who we are without those stories of displacements, of movement, of journeys. And there are so many stories that get told and that don't get told in those journeys. And if I had all the time I'd go back and sort of try and trace those journeys. In many ways, our journeys are similar in that my family also comes originally from what is now Bangladesh, from Dhaka and around. And my father also grew up in Assam. He grew up in
You never know. We may be related in some way.
Related, of course.
All Bangalis are related at some level.
Either through Machedhol or something else. We definitely are. Which reminds me, we exchanged some pictures earlier this month about our own Shosher Mat, right?
It's true. When you invited me, I got very excited. So I felt very nostalgic for Shosher Mat. So that's what I made for lunch.
Do you have a favorite sort of Bengali comfort food? Is there one?
I think it's Shosher Mat. I think it's Shosher Mat for sure. I mean, my mother is a Tamilian from Kerala, speaking of migration. And, I think you're exactly right around these many journeys and the continuum of migration, right? From forced migration and displacement and to the choosing of the Prabashi identity, as some of us have done. Yeah, so she finds fish very difficult, and she comes, originally from a vegetarian family, so from a Brahmin family. So we can talk about caste and that work later. But it meant that it was very hard for her to join a very Bengali family. But I love March, so every time I would go to Kolkata to my grandparents and my Pishima's place, my Pishima would make me march from, like, literally every meal would have march in it,
right?
From breakfast. From breakfast.
And this is one of the hardest questions, but I have to ask you, because your roots are in what used to be East Bengal. Do you ever eat shutki mach?
Oh, I think
favorite things in the world, and nobody understands why I love shutki mach so much, but I just love it.
My father does. My father loves it. I will have it, but not quite as happily. Let me put it that way. But it's true. It's an acquired taste.
It is definitely an acquired taste, as is cheese. I mean, I grew up in Switzerland, so much of the cheese there is very much acquired taste. It's wonderful that you mentioned your mother, because your mother is herself quite a formidable woman, and she's an author in her own right, and writes for children, and writes a column for children as well, has written many plays. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that side of the family?
Sure. So my father's name is Obijit Sengupta. My mother is Poili, and that's also an interesting story. Her first name is Ambika, but because she came from a Tamil family, she was called, G Ambika, the classic South Indian way in which the father's initial, which was Gopalakrishnan, it's an initial that you take, and then you have your name. So as she grew up, she was called G Ambika. It so happened that my grandfather went to Kolkata when she was very young. She joined Ashok Hall in kindergarten, and the Irish nuns could not understand why this child had a surname that was Ambika and a first name that was G. They just could not understand this, and she was too young to explain. So they knew that she was the firstborn because her younger brother was also in kindergarten. So they started calling her Poili from Poila. So her name, her nom de plume, is actually Poili, which has a very strong Bengali connection. So, as she says, Bengali is the imperial language of the subcontinent, because every Obangali who marries a Bengali ends up learning Bangla, because of course it's mishti and beautiful and all of it. And every Bengali, or very few Bengalis, learn their partner's languages. So my father, for instance, is pathetic in Malayalam and in Tamil. He can basically say puam, nere puam, which basically means let's go. Vegam puam, let's go fast. Verlam verlam, which is, I want water. That's about it. But my mother speaks Bangla very well.
That's amazing. And I wonder if anybody else across India has this distinction of Bangali and Obangali. Everybody for us is either Bangali or Obangali. And as far as
this is true.
Obangali, then it doesn't really matter about the distinctions between the different kinds of Bangali.
This is true, yeah. This is very true.
Any other languages that use that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I speak a bunch of languages because of my strange upbringing. And it's true, there is no other language that has quite this distinction between, this version of us and them, which is just Bengali and Obangali. And then you, of course, have to say Probashi Bengali, because you have to say, Amar Bangla oto porishkar noy, and then you have to sort of scramble to make sure that all the relatives don't get upset when you don't remember exactly what to call them,
I mean,
Ishipishimao, Pishimoni, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the subtle differences of relationship when you call somebody Pishima versus
exactly,
Pishimoni, right? I mean, Bangla to khubi porishkar. I'm very. It's wonderful to hear it, actually.
Well, two Probashi Bengalis speaking, the bar is very low. My bar is very low.
It actually brings me to one of the questions somebody asked if they've how many languages actually do you speak, given that you have connections to so many?
It's a good question. It depends on how. I don't read and write any languages more than English and Hindi because I grew up primarily in sort of government schools or government affiliated schools in India. So of course English and Hindi were the two main languages. But I speak Kannada because I grew up in Karnataka, and that's been both the language of my childhood, but also the language of some of my work as I became an activist.
Yeah.
I speak some Bangla, I speak some Tamil, I speak some Malayalam. My Malayalam is more of the I can understand Malayalam, but I've now married a Malayali.
Okay.
My brother married a Bengali, so the family is complete. My parents were very amused, but we ended up completing this family in a very strange way.
Yeah.
But so I sort of, I guess, what does that make it? 5, 6 languages, and I speak a little bit of French.
After 3. That was wonderful. That's amazing. I mean,
we pun in lingual languages, yeah, which is fun.
Yes, absolutely. And there's so many. I mean, humor, for example, is something that's so typical to specific languages. For example, it's one of the great pleasures of knowing a different language because you also see jokes in different lights and different kinds of humors and ways of seeing the world. It's wonderful. You mentioned activism, and it's very clear from watching your journey that the seeds of activism and advocacy were kind of present very early on in your life. And if I can ask how that came about, was it through your parents or where you were growing up? Or
I've often wondered, and I don't think some people have sort of these epiphanies, these moments, and I don't know whether I have moments. I have a series of moments, if you like. I do know that one of my earliest memories, very clear memories, is of being about maybe 5 or 6 years old and going with my father to because he was inaugurating a water tank. And this is in Raichur, which is, an extremely dry part of Karnataka. It was practically a desert as I was growing up. And the water tank was such an extraordinary symbol for the villagers who had come. And I remember vividly this seeing the sun on the water and seeing the faces of those around with, the sense of both joy and amazement. And it's only, of course, as I grew older that I looked back and understood what that was about. But to recognize what it meant to have water in a land that otherwise didn't, and what it meant as a resource, was something, I think, different bits of that, of growing up in northern Karnataka, sort of came back to me. And I quit academia. I did a economics degree at Lady Shriram College, and I did economics because I thought it would combine all my many joys of the humanities and the social sciences and the sciences together. I was really wrong because I learned, classic neoliberal economics, and I was like, where's the poverty and prosperity critique here? And so I quit. And, in India at the time, to do the gap year or to do gap years was just unheard of. It was very difficult. And I still believe it's probably very difficult to take time off in your trajectory of education if you want to. You go from the undergraduate to the master's to a PhD like, a long train. But I felt I couldn't. And I essentially went back to where I had grown up. I went back to North Karnataka and I worked in an NGO there for a couple of years. And I'm lucky that I, was able to continue my education after that. But I remember my parents being very, very worried for me at the same time as supportive, because it was really unheard of at the time to just take that break from education, as it were. But that time that I spent in villages across North Karnataka, doing participatory research, in fact, well before it was known and well before everyone ended up calling it design thinking. That was probably the best education I could have got.
It's amazing, and it's such a potent symbol that you start really with water, because water is so deeply connected, not just to things like the culture, right? Why is that the certain cuisine of certain regions of India look like they look, and it's so deeply related to the access to water or the lack of access to water. But also it's so incredibly deeply political in India when we think about, as you said, the lack of access to water, but also thinking about Roy and the dams, and the displacement of tribal population because of water, and so on. And such a sort of almost a theme running through the politics of India.
And the gendered nature of it as well, and the violence attached to water and gender.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
And then after Lady Shriram College, did you go directly to Oxford after that?
So that's when I spent the years in villages of North Karnataka. And then at some point, my father, who is, sort of a good middle-class dad, turned around, and also very Bengali, so had a huge big Bengali temper tantrum, where he basically said, I can't afford to send you to university if you don't get a scholarship. What you're doing, you have to think about your future, and all the rest of that you can put in every Bengali melodramatic version of that scene. So it so happened that a friend had sent me, entirely without my asking, had sent application forms for the Rhodes Scholarship, for the INLACs and for the Rhodes. INLACs was already, the deadline had passed. The Rhodes Scholarship deadline was the next day. And I basically sat that night weeping in fury at my father, and did the application and sent it off.
In other words, like a true academic.
In other words, at the last minute, like a true academic. Yes, exactly. Panic sharpens the mind.
Absolutely. And your experience in activism, had it already shaped what you wanted to do in Oxford?
Yes, I think so. I think it was really interesting, because I ended up as the first, or the guinea pig year, of the MPhil in Development Studies at Oxford. And, it's just, it marked 20 years a couple of years ago. So I was there in 1996 to 98. And it made such a difference that I was, I had done what I had done, because I think if I had gone to Oxford without having had the journey I'd had through Karnataka, through northern Karnataka, and through the many villages and stories and histories, I wouldn't have appreciated what I was working through in theory. I needed the practice, and in some ways that has been my journey since. In everything, it's been that sense of praxis. What is my praxis in life, and what is the praxis that I can share with others? But I think it came straight out of that. It was very interesting to go, and crazy and hard to go straight from, a really poor village in North Karnataka to the spires of Oxford. It was a very strange journey. And I would wake up in Oxford thinking, just a few months ago, I was sort of sitting and listening to people making roti women making roti at 4 a.m. This is a very strange, surreal experience. But it also meant that my commitment to that world was very clear from that point on, that I would not, I don't know whether I can tell you that I had, again, any particular moment where that commitment became very clear, but I always knew I'd go back to India. I would work in India. I would not take the Goldman and Sachs McKinsey route that Oxford is very well known for.
Yes.
In fact, I never went for any wine and cheese reception. I was probably the only one. who never went for even a single one. I mean, as a political anthropologist, I should have gone just to sort of look at what it was like. Yeah, exactly, with a little diary. But I never did. And I went back to India.
Yes. And that's actually really interesting. I want to ask you a little bit what it was like going from even doing activism, but within your own kind of context and with that privilege, arriving somewhere which is the sort of the whitest place of the white places, and what that was like, and how you were seen and how you experienced that time.
It was terrifying. It was terrifying. It was really terrifying, and I think. It was terrifying because I was also a very middle-class child. I mean, the status I had was through caste privilege, which I started understanding only when I was much older, and through education, of course, and through the fact that my father was, working his way through the Indian civil services. But I wasn't of the kind of family that thought that Oxford or Cambridge was even, in the ballpark. There was no horizon that included leaving India, that included a scholarship like the Rhodes Scholarship, that included being in Oxford and Cambridge. It was really not something I had ever imagined. So to be in Oxford was just astonishing. And then Oxford itself became a really interesting and poignant collage of the good, the bad, the ugly, as it were. There were very few academics who were brown. There was one academic who was black in my sphere, and this is development studies, so it was more political and progressive than most other departments. And Nandini Gupta was one of my teachers, so there was a Bengali. But I remember, in fact, one of my closest advisors and sort of big sisters was an academic called Karma Nabulsi, who's a Palestinian academic. And there was something about just recognizing how few role models I had at the time in Oxford. And also recognizing how much it was the center of the British Empire. I remember going past Balliol and striking my fist up, thinking, this was the heart of the British Empire. Here, all the colonial administrators came out of Balliol and everywhere around. I remember having a huge, really painful argument with Niall Ferguson, the right-wing historian, whom I happened to be seated at a dinner table with, because he went on about how the partition of Bengal was an administrative decision, the 1905 partition of Bengal. And I was 22 and fiery, but it was hard to sort of see where to send that fire in the Oxford of those times. And yet I had really, really good friends and some incredible professors who, held me through all the bad and ugly. But I did not go back to Oxford till 20 years later, a couple of years ago. It was very hard for me to go back to Oxford. So it took a lot to go back. Yeah.
I can imagine. Even I suppose doing learning from a discipline like anthropology, which has such strong colonial roots, must have been quite something.
Yeah.
having to learn it without having that kind of critical sort of support of looking at that discipline through different kinds of eyes.
Yeah.
And then, so what made a political anthropologist then become part of the Wikimedia Foundation? How does that work?
Oh my goodness. Well, I went back to India to do a PhD, to do a DPhil in politics, using sort of doing an ethnography of the state, right? And I ended up sort of leading a UNICEF project on violence against women and children with the Karnataka police. So it was meant to be an ethnography of the Karnataka police and through it, theories of the Indian state. So that was my political anthropological lens at work. And then the Gujarat genocide happened in 2002. And I dropped my PhD and went back into full-time activism. Clearly did not succeed, given who runs our country right now. But it was a very painful time, and at the same time, it was an extraordinary time of activists and academics and trade unionists and just general public and progressive religious leaders all coming together in a very astoundingly powerful coalition, at least in Bangalore, where we were doing this work. But at the same time, it got progressively harder. And as I was working on violence against women and children, it sort of had its own toll on my body and soul. And by this time, I'd met my partner, who had been in the tech industry for 10 years and wanted to go back to university to study the politics of the internet. It so happened. So we ended up in Berkeley, California, for him to do a PhD. And then, after the 2 years of my being a spouse of a student who couldn't work in the classic, US style.
H1B visa or whatever they're called.
So I have been through every version of the visa that the US has, but at the time he was on the F1 and I was on the F2, which is a student visa. Then he got onto the J1 just so that I could teach, so I could work when he went from the master's to the PhD, and I ended up at the Global Fund for Women. And then I ended up at the Wikimedia Foundation. To understand the Wikimedia Foundation story, it's useful to know that I studied computer science at school. I think we were just talking about it, my partner and I, and we were probably one of the first generations of Indian students to study computers in school. So, probably the batch above us and us. So 91, 92 was the first time that, we had computers in Indian schools and we were taught it so I chose computer science rather than biology. And so, I'd always been tech oriented. And then, of course, Bangalore being the hotbed of free and open source software. And then, of course, every other tech, you throw a stone and you hit a techie in Bangalore, two of whom happened to be in my family, my brother and my partner. It so happened that questions and conversations around tech were very much part of our world. And because I was a feminist and working in social justice movements, one of the things I was trying to do was to bring the free and open source software movement together with the feminist movements. And I didn't succeed at the time. I think I was a little too early in the mid-2000s with that conversation. But that history basically took me into the Wikimedia Foundation. And then, of course, that brought all my different selves, the feminist self, the social justice self, the nerdy techie self, as well as, I suppose, the many Prabhashi versions of myself, because they wanted someone who was also, who had an understanding of the Global South.
Mm-hmm. And what was that work like? Because I can imagine that at that time, Wikipedia was still very white, very male dominated, very cis dominated. What was that like? How did you even find the language to do the kind of work that you are interested in? Were people listening, or were they open to it, or?
That's a really good question. And I love that you put it as language, because language is such a key way in which Wikipedians understand themselves. Mm-hmm. So the Wikimedia movement and Wikipedia itself is sort of divided into language communities, right, because of, which language you write in or you edit in. But at the same time, the larger sort of meta language of social justice is something that has only been more recent, and it's still hotly debated, because, of course, a great many of us see the right to information and this sort of online public knowledge that is for and from us all to be a significant progressive right and goal. And yet, as you said, Wikipedia at the time and the Wikimedia movement wasn't quite there. I had many, many allies, and I also had some very, very difficult days. It was Sisyphean to try and, gently but firmly explain to a Silicon Valley-based nonprofit, even though it was a nonprofit, it still is very San Francisco-based, or was at the time, that, their tech hubris was not going to was not valid for what their overall mission was. That if they wanted the sum of human knowledge, which is the sort of unambitious goal of Wikipedia, then they had to think about what this truly meant. And so it was one of the reasons I sort of began Whose Knowledge. I left the Wikimedia Foundation in 2015, and in 2016, along with two other friends from the Wikimedia Foundation, in fact, Siko Bouters and Adeli Vrana. As you mentioned, we set up this feminist collective called Whose Knowledge, because we realized we were still part of the Wikimedia movement, and were very happy to be. We were, proud Wikipedians and continue to be. And yet we wanted to demonstrate the tough love that it needed to start critiquing and pushing the boundaries of what Wikimedians and the broader public thought of as knowledge, and thought of as representative of all of humanity.
I want to talk a little bit more about, of course, about your work of Whose Knowledge, but what perhaps might be useful first, because to maybe even explain some of these words, because you and I use them every day, but it's probably not very, so it's not everyday language in terms of what you even mean by the global South, what we mean by even doing social justice. What does that mean, doing social justice on the internet? And we'll come to this in a minute. When you talk about Whose Knowledge, what does it mean to decolonize the internet?
Sure, I'd love to hear your definitions as well, because as always, no words are perfect, and I have often spent time saying to folks, well, we can define in order to clarify, but at the end of the day, actions are what matter. So what the outcomes are of what we do is what matters.
Activist said.
Because this is where I can gently slide away from the academic scholarly side of myself, which is like, definitions are important, but moving on. But they are important, and it's interesting because the Global South became a term that was hotly debated within the Wikimedia movement. And part of it was because a great many people didn't even know the history of the term. And so even some allies were against it because they thought that it was a pejorative term, right? And I sort of had to explain the history and say, well, actually, it came up as a term to counter the third world, developing nation sort of narratives that are actually deeply pejorative, because it assumes that there's only one way in which we should develop, and in one direction, and that the first world is the first world and the third world is the third world, and never the twain do meet. And so I sort of had to explain the kind of progressive scholarship that led to the notion of the Global South as being, essentially the countries that have had histories of colonization by primarily European colonial powers. But that then means that, of course, geographically it sort of covers Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific Islands. But, it is a political term. It's not a geographical term, which is also something that I think is important for us to say, because then people sort of confuse it with the geographical South rather than the sense of what this means as a political term. And of course, when you start thinking of it now, I think there's more and more, I think we nuance it with the fact that if as a political term of power and privilege, there's a global South and the global North and a global North and the global South, because the global capitalist elite are the global capitalist elite. At this point, you can look at Indian multi-billionaires on the same level as American multi-billionaires or English multi-billionaires. So in fact, many of whom who live in London, as we know, right? Speaking of the Indian diaspora. So that's one. And then for me, social justice has really been about imagining and working towards a world in which all of us have equivalent opportunities to be all that we want to be. And the reason I say equivalent rather than equal is because as feminists, we classically say equality is not sameness. And so I want to celebrate difference. I want to celebrate difference, but not have difference become division. Mm-hmm. And so I suppose that is the world I imagine. And then decolonizing the internet, therefore, really is about examining both the historical and current structures of power and privilege that essentially, as we began this conversation, means that who produces what we talk of as the internet, who produces the infrastructure, who governs it, who designs the apps and the platforms, and who profits from it, who produces the content that we see every day, and then who thinks about what that user experience is, right? You and I talking to each other. Very, very rarely is it folks like you and me. Very, very rarely, even more rarely, is it folks like you and me talking in Bangla or in Twi or in Swahili. Swahili became the first African language that Twitter internationalized just 2 years ago, right? The internet is overwhelmingly English, yes. Overwhelmingly. Over 50% of content, nearly 60% of all content on the internet is in English. And even though we have, as you know, post-colonial British citizens have, the empire has struck back and we all have our various Englishes. Yeah. The fact that you still have to learn your nearest colonial language in order to be on the internet is, I think, a measure of how deeply skewed and imbalanced it is. And so decolonizing the internet has all of these different aspects, looking at who produces, who experiences, who governs, who has leadership in this global infrastructure that is so ubiquitous now.
Questions of language is so important. Just the way you beautifully put it, that you have to learn your closest colonial language in order to access what we think is democratic and free information is absolutely mind-blowing, isn't it? And it's even more so, not people who look like you and me, and even less so people with different abilities, different disabilities, for example. The internet is even less inclusive of other kinds of ways of being in the world, right? And the question of leadership is so important. We talk, especially in the time of pandemics, for example, how much something like a global health emergency like the corona affects, for example, women and non-binary people more adversely, that they are the forefront of care work, of informal work, or all this labor that is not either recognized in stable times and definitely not recognized in the pandemic, and yet they suffer, some of the greatest adverse effects increase, not just in terms of health, but of course violence is one of those things as well. And yet there are so few women leaders at the forefront of public health and public health policies. and the decision making around this, and even fewer women of color who are at the forefront of this.
Yes. In fact, it's really interesting you should say that, Ago, because we run every year from March to May a campaign called the Visible Wiki Women campaign, which is to bring the images of notable women from around the world onto Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is notorious in that only about 20% of all biographies on Wikipedia are about women, and a fourth of those biographies have images. So the invisibility of women and trans and non-binary folks goes very, very deep. So our theme for this year was infrastructures of care. So women in critical infrastructures of care. And, a sub-focus every year is what we call women of colors. So from the global south, from multiple marginalized communities. And one of the people we honored this time, and whose photograph came on along with a new article about her, is a Ghanaian scientist called Veronica Biko, who essentially had in previous sort of health crises developed what is called the Veronica bucket, which could, transport water safely and cleanly. She wasn't honored on Wikipedia till we had a wonderful Wikipedian friend of ours from Ghana actually go and meet with her post lockdown in Ghana and take a picture of hers and bring her on to Wikipedia and write the article about her. And it's exactly as you say, there's so few of those celebrations, and there's so few of those who are acknowledged in this leadership, even as we know the disproportionate nature of the impact of global health crises on women and children. I think it's not it is a correlation, not a coincidence, that most of the nations that have done relatively well in tackling the crisis, and certainly the regions, for instance, Kerala in India, have been led by women. So, and yet we do not acknowledge this enough.
Even when the leadership is present, right? It's not just leadership. Even when even our ideas of what leadership looks like, and what counts as leadership is very much informed by our own kind of histories and understanding of what we've been taught, what leadership looks like, and who is allowed to be a leader.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right.
And so much of your work, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about your sort of both feminist and anti-racist and intersectional work within Whose Knowledge, and how you brought that about, but also that connection to your other kinds of activism, so your anti-casteist activism, sort of talking a little bit about also the racism and the colorism that exist within our own communities and how we often fail to recognize that. So yes, a lot of things.
Well,
where you want to start, but I want to hear all about that.
I'm trying to think about where to start. Well, let's just start with saying, I'll start with the caste system, because I think it's the piece that is closest to my heart, and it's also the one that is deepest and most difficult, I think, for all of us who are Indian. It's been extraordinary for me to recognize that being Prabashi how much it has helped me really understand what caste implies. And the reason is that, of course, race and caste are not the same, but there is resonance enough that to learn what it means to be a brown body and to be a brown female body in primarily white or white passing environments is a really good lesson in recognizing what it means to be a Dalit, Bahujan, or Adivasi body in primarily Savarna and upper caste contexts. And so I've been an anti-caste activist since I was a teenager, right? Since I started understanding what caste was, and since I started unpacking it for myself, and through my conversations with my parents. And yet it was really interesting, the fact that I learned so late what caste was, because my parents, like good Savarna progressive parents, didn't want to tell me about caste because they thought not knowing about caste would allow me not to need to deal with it. And that is exactly what progressive white folks do about race, right?
Absolutely.
They don't tell their children about race because they think this is the way to make their children grow up with an a-racial lens, right? And yet, as we know, the world is not there yet. And so, actually, what we need is to deeply confront casteism or racism, all of us. And just as it is disproportionately the responsibility of white folks to understand what racism does to the rest of us, it is disproportionately the responsibility of us as Savarnas to understand what caste does to those who are oppressed by it. And for me, I think what I find really hard is that this is the social structure of the world that is least examined by its own inhabitants, right? And especially by those who are the oppressors, those who benefit from it. Even progressive Savarnas find it really hard to talk about caste and to talk about casteism. It was really hard for me, to bring back the Bengali side of it, the day that I realized that Pujo, like Durga Puja, there's a way in which Pujo has a deeply Savarna strain to it, that the way we think about Mahishasura is really problematic.
Absolutely.
And so one of the things that I have done ever since I realized this was that every festival that we then celebrate, because of course it's part of my culture and I do want to mark it with family and friends, but every festival for me is also about re-examining its history, re-examining its impacts, and recommitting to being anti-casteist. Because that is the only way in which I could go and see, the Protima. Otherwise, for me, it's very difficult now to manage that. And I think there's something, Bengalis have always been revolutionaries, but I think this is one of the things we are not revolutionary about. We're deeply, deeply, I think, paralyzed around. And yet my parents sent me a very beautiful picture of a Pratima recently, which was of a Pratima in the form of a migrant worker, a woman returning, that's been doing the rounds. And I thought to myself, how beautiful is that? Because in many ways it brings the issues of class. And of course, in India, class is very often intersected with caste and ethnicity. It's hard to go away from that. So that migrant woman worker is probably Dalit or Adivasi or Bahujan. And those are the ways in which I think we can look at, our cultural origins differently and examine them differently. But it is, for me, one of the hardest things because caste travels, right? And it travels into the Prabashi communities. I was just listening to an incredible webinar on caste in the UK, talking about how many young people and adults face casteism in the UK. An organization that I'm on the advisory board for, and that whose knowledge works with very closely, called Equality Labs in the US, has done an extraordinary survey of caste in the US. And that is a Dalit Bahujan-led feminist organization. So the work is being done by extraordinary Dalit Bahujan and Adivasi leaders, but it is not their work to do primarily. It is ours. And the cognitive dissonance is that we are all so sharp around race. We're so good about talking about racism. But the fact that you can be anti-Trump and pro-Modi, the fact that you can be anti-racist and pro-caste, is to me the deepest cognitive dissonance that the Indian Desi community has. And if there's one thing that I want us to to shift and work on in practice, it is that.
I mean, there's so many things you've said where I just wanted to stop you at every sentence and ask you to say so much more about it, because this really is so close to my heart. I mean, I have many friends who often ask me, when do we talk to our children about race and colorism? When do we talk about slavery and things like that? And I say, well, from the beginning, right? You absolutely need to talk to your children about race from day one, because guess what? You have the privilege of choosing when you talk about race to your children. A little Black girl does not have the privilege of choosing when she talks about or thinks about race, because that is, the world does not see her in the same eyes. But and it's absolutely amazing how much of that ease in language I have talking about, telling my friends about this, is very much is built on the work that has been done by activists. And there's so little of that when we think about the discussion around caste. That language does not come to me that easily, right? So I have a very a slightly cringy but funny anecdote for you. So I was making pancakes with my little one day, and I said to her, right, these are in 2 plates, and we'll eat the savory ones first, and then we'll eat the sweet ones. And then 2 minutes later, I hear her shouting to her dad, Dad, Mom said the slavery one first, and then and I didn't stop her right then. And I thought, I mean, it's absolutely a good thing that those words are in her head, right? She hasn't learned to use them properly yet, of course. But that's in her head. But in the same way, I spent many, many years going about I feel so cringy now thinking about it, as so much privilege, going around saying, if friends ask me, because back 5-10 years ago, friends still used to ask me, yo, what caste are you? It's one of those exotic things that your white friends ask you. And I'd say, oh, I'm not from any caste. I've sort of left the cloak of caste many years ago. My husband and I, we don't believe in caste. And I turned back and I thought, what incredible, horrible privilege allows me to say something like that. Of course, I have the privilege of saying I don't believe in caste and I don't live in caste, because I don't have to live in caste. I live in privilege, right? And so it's just, there's so much to be done around this. Where do we even start, Anasuya? How do we teach our children? How do we talk to them about this?
I think exactly as you said, Ago, but you start by having the conversations. You start by breaking the silences. And, I think the deepest and most difficult conversations are always the most intimate, right? Yes. It's always easier to talk to others. It's always easier to talk outwardly. The conversations with family are often the hardest, and yet they're the ones that are most important. And so I think that's where you begin, exactly the way that you said, let's talk about race. I think we have to talk about caste. I think we have to look at the scholarship that is coming up from brilliant Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi leaders. There are some incredible Dalit feminists that are writing and speaking that, are my inspirations right now. There's a very good and pithy piece that, in fact, Tenmuri Soundararajan, who runs Equality Labs, has, called The Caste Primer, that, I don't know if you've seen it. It's a Caste 101. I can send that to you. There are organizations that are anti-caste in the UK that people can sort of look to. There was a caste survey that was done in the UK, I think a few years ago, that I think would be useful for people to look at, because it's useful to remember that even as, the horrifying nature of caste violence in India is horrifying, right? I mean, the levels of violence that is caste-based violence, including and especially on Dalit women, is horrifying. And, what you face in Prabashi communities is obviously not at the same level, and yet, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So there are resources that as I said, a great many, I realize you're right. There are not a great many resources, but I think they're growing and they're powerful. And coming back to the conversation around knowledge, They're also in forms that I think are important for us to recognize as sources of knowledge that are not the classic published book or the opinion piece, right? Bengalis, or at least, sort of middle caste, upper caste Bengalis, we're very literary folks, and yet that too is privilege. As my Dalit friends remind me, text and the pen have been weapons of the powerful and the privileged. And so for us to look at oral sources, to look at the webinars that are happening, to look at the interviews that people do, I think is really, really important. And to recognize that those are valid sources. There's an incredible, there is resources on the Equality Lab site, but there's also a film crew called Dalit Camera that does little films and builds up footage of Dalit-based, both Dalit violence, but also interviews with Dalit intellectuals and scholars and activists. That would be good to look at. But I can certainly send you. We could, in fact, maybe that's something we should think about post this conversation, to think of as an action we can do together.
That'd be wonderful. I'd so much look forward to doing that with you. There's something that really struck me around when we were talking about caste in the UK as well, something around the co-opting of language, right? So even people when they try to talk about the problem of caste in the UK, there's very much a big, I would say, movement against it, under the language of this is the colonizers doing more colonizing, right? Do not say anything bad about India, because if you say anything bad about India, you're just being the colonizer again, right? So there's very much sort of the silencing of that, the caste discussion in the UK by those who co-opt the decolonizing language. And I was just wondering whether you have any thoughts around how we counter that. How do we just have these conversations more? Is that the way to go?
I think so. And I think also to remind ourselves of Dr. Ambedkar, right? Because why is it that we can quote Martin Luther King, but we can't quote Dr. Ambedkar? What is it about us as Indians that this is true, right? That all our children know Dr. Martin Luther King and they do not know B.R. Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar. And yet Dr. Ambedkar said this so clearly. That was the core of his divergence from Gandhi, which was, he said, political freedom cannot be won at the expense of social freedom, right? And so for me, liberation has to be about everyone's liberation. No one is free till we are all free. And classically, around the world, in multiple communities, people have been told your freedom and your liberation has to wait.
Yes.
We'll wait. It'll come. Don't worry, it'll happen. But you have to wait. So for us as Black and brown folks, are we going to turn around and say, oh, so racism needs to wait for every white person to recognize it's terrible and we don't have to fight for it? In which case, is that the same? And is that true for casteism? That we have to only look at the exceptions of when there is co-optation rather than the actual realities of what happens to Dalit Bahujan folks. I think there's something very important to recognize, that we are no longer in a world in which we can ask people to wait for their liberation. And in fact, our liberations are so intersectional that our freedom means nothing when there are others who are not free. There's a very beautiful line from a American lesbian feminist that I always use, which is, liberation is a symphony of revolutions. And it needs all of those revolutions for us to feel truly free. And so there's no waiting. We all have to do the work.
That's really very much at the core of Black feminism, isn't it? that there's no liberation without everybody's liberation. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that is true for Dalit feminism. That's true for, I think, every marginalized community that is marginalized, but not the minority. I mean, we are the majority of the world.
Yes, we're the global majority who've been minority.
We are exactly the marginalized. As I've started saying, we're the marginalized majority.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great term. There's so much discussion around the right use of language at the moment. I work also with women's aid organization here in Edinburgh, and we talk a lot about how we label ourselves. Do we, the issues around BME and people of color, and do we still use the term Black and so on? But I think, more than trying to find an answer to this, just having those conversations is what brings us to the sort of the issues actually that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
Mentioning Ambedkar really brings us back to when you and I first met. We met at a reading group on Ambedkar, and that's been, since then I've been following your work, and it's been really a dream of mine to actually talk to you a little bit more about your work. And since then, having had this hour with you has been such a privilege for me, such an honor, and my admiration for you and your work has really exploded. And I really look forward to the many more conversations.
Absolutely.
Was there anything else you sort of wanted to talk about before?
No, I mean, this has been lovely, and it is interesting because, in fact, we met via the Tamil side of me, because the Ambedkar's study group was actually convened by a cousin of mine who comes from my mother's side, which is lovely. Who's a wonderful feminist philosopher who is, I think, a friend of yours, right, Ago?
A friend of mine. She's a colleague that I admire very much. Her work is fantastic. It's absolutely.
I love Mira's work, and the wonderful thing about Mira is that we have never met, and her mother and my mother are very close, but we have never met. And so it's very lovely that we admire each other. As we said at some point, we admire each other because or despite of being cousins. I really admire her work. It's wonderful work.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Anasuya, for coming today. It's been, I've been looking forward to this so much, and it's been a wonderful late afternoon, evening, or midnight as it looks like outside for me. No, it's just a wonderful way to warm up these cold afternoons, and I'm sure our audience has really also greatly benefited from having heard your story. And again, coming back, this is why I wanted to spend some time talking about your story, because the stories are so important. It is not the facts and the information and the numbers, the narratives and the stories are very important. So thank you so much for being who you are, for doing this work, and I really hope that we get many more chances to talk.
Right back at you. I am looking forward to many more addas together, and maybe even, having some shoshe match in Shinghara.
Wonderful.
At some point.
Person again. And in the meantime, there will be cha and adda.
There will indeed be cha and adda. There we go.
Is that a cup you made yourself?
That is a mug that I made myself. It's an elephant mug.
Oh, beautiful. That's incredible.
I love elephants. I'm a good Desi in that I really love elephants.
And is pottery one of your ways of sort of taking your mind off some of the more difficult questions of the world?
I think pottery has been a sanity anchor for me in the last few years. I came to it very late, only about 3 or 4 years ago, and it's the one thing that does not allow you to think about anything else while you are on the wheel. It's an extraordinary thing. It's extremely tactile, and it's really something that is a meditation in the present. It both forces you to be it, and it wants you to be that. And so for me, even though I'm a terrible potter, I just love it. It's my place of joy. So yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. I do hope you get to continue doing that. It's so important for us. They talk about self-care, but it's so important to have these other joyful things in our life as well as our work.
Exactly.
I thought you can see very many lovely comments from friends here, and they say please do visit us in Edinburgh. Absolutely. That's absolutely on top of my list. So when people can travel again, when there's a vaccine and all of that, I absolutely will look to bring you first to the university as well. I think academia can definitely do with some of this conversation as well. But we'll also look to doing something with the Indian community, with the Bon community here.
And that would be love.
Of a mate chol potluck.
Oh, that would be lovely. And I can and you know, given that I am half Bengali and half from Kerala, I've been called bonkers all my life. So you know that confused child still exists. So I'll bring my confused self, my many selves, up to Edinburgh. I love Edinburgh, so I would love to come back, and I would love to come back to find the Bengali community.
We'll certainly make sure that happens in that case. Thank you so much again for your time, for your work. I think most importantly for the work you do. Please continue doing it. And
well, right back at you. Thank you for all that you do and all that you are. Dhanyabad.
Take care, Anasuya. Bye.
You too. Bye. Bye.